Hi, my name is Ben Hudson, and this is JSON Schema in Production, where we talk to those spearheading JSON Schema within their organization and how they're using JSON Schema today. So today we have with us David Brownman, Senior Backend Engineer at Zapier. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really great. I'm really excited to be talking to you today about how you're using JSON Schema at Zapier. I've been a long time fan of Zapier, and I actually use it for JSON Schema, so it's useful for us.
Nice.
Why don't we start off with you telling us a little bit about who is David, and what do you get up to when you're working at Zapier?
Yeah. So like you said, I'm David. I've been working at Zapier for 5.5 years now. I'm based in the Bay Area of California. And I basically the whole time have been working on the dev platform team. So Zapier consists of all these integrations that we serve to our end users. Someone has to build those integrations, and we don't want to do all of it. So we have this developer platform that enables our partners. It's going to be, everyone all the way Amazon, all the way down to little startups we've never heard of, building this self-serve integration platform. So they can use kind of a standard set of tools to connect their API to Zapier using a common interface. And then they get every other connection with a Zapier integration for free, which is, a great business proposition.
Yeah, definitely. I know we find it really valuable. So what's sort of your role and responsibilities? What do you what are you responsible for?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm on the developer platform team. We own a couple of different products and part of that customer journey. So we have a CLI tool, which is how developers test and build their integrations. We have an API that does read and write operations for like maintaining these apps. And then we have a visual builder, which does a lot of the same things the CLI does, but in kind of a more on Rails experience. It's just a web UI, and you can click through and do a lot of the same things, but you don't have to have a whole Node.js environment set up. You don't have to know how to use the CLI, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with the UI for building apps, that's for sure. So what sort of keeps you motivated? You've been with Zapier, I guess some people would say a long time for the tech industry, and yeah, what is it about Zapier and what keeps you motivated?
Yeah. I think it's kind of a cliched answer, but the team, honestly, we have hired a really great set of now over 600 people. And it's kind of remarkable. Everyone's great. I like the work we're doing. I really like writing code that other people, use and rely on. I think we kind of hold ourselves to a high bar and ship a great product as a result.
Yeah, when you can see the value that you're bringing to others, I know I find that motivating myself. And yeah, a great team just makes so much of a difference. So obviously we're here today to talk about how you're using JSON Schema. So before we delve into exactly how you're using JSON Schema, can you tell me what was the challenge that you encountered that sort of led you to look for a solution where JSON Schema was one of the contenders?
Yeah, certainly. So give a little bit of background context. Before we have the developer platform that we have today, we had an older one, which we now call the legacy web builder. This was also a web UI, and developers could write integrations by clicking around, but everything was stored in individual database rows. So they would say add trigger, and then the trigger would have a foreign key to an app, and you could add fields that had foreign keys to that trigger, and it was all kind of very structured in the database, which was great. It let us again structure everything very rigorously, and had a very guided experience making integrations. But the problem we ran into is that as integrations became more complex and involved, people wanted different environments, people wanted different a lot of different bits. We found that a web UI developer experience wasn't really cutting it, right? When you want to solve engineering problems, you want to use the tools that you're used to. You want to use version control, you want to use your editor, you want to use linting and stuff like that. And so we had to kind of look at the next step in that journey and figure out how we can support engineers kind of where they are instead of asking them to come to us. So the overall goal was to let them write code and ship it to us as an integration, which sounded great, but we had this issue of, okay, now we have to somehow enforce sort of our database schema on this code that people can just ship us. They can ship us really anything. How do we, set guidelines and guardrails around that. So we played around with a few things, but kind of where we ended up is that partners will write a Node.js application that exports a JSON object, basically a JavaScript object that we JSONify. And we can use JSON schema to enforce properties on that exported object. So we don't care how they build it. They can use TypeScript, they can use Babel, they can use whatever, as long as what they ultimately export complies with our schema that we give to them.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that's definitely a challenge. And what sort of problems were you encountering before you, looked to standardize? What sort of problems was it causing for you? Was it sort of like really noticeable?
Yeah, I think it was most of the problems we were hitting were kind of in the design phase of knowing what sort of things we could enforce and where. So right now we ship our CLI to developers, but again, it's in user land, it's kind of untrusted code. They just upload zip files to us, and then we have to validate them server side. We provide kind of client side validation also, but we can't rely on that because they could use their own version of the CLI and build something that doesn't actually comply with the schema. So one of the big design issues was how do we have a kind of distributable cross-platform validation system, right? In Python and JavaScript separately, there are a lot of great validation libraries, but we have to have something that we could run all the rules on the client side in the CLI, let them pass, and then do the same thing on the server side in Python, and ideally power that off of one schema or something. And that's where JSON schema really shined for us, because we could write the schema once and then apply it both places in totally separate languages, but with consistency.
Yeah, having that ubiquity across different languages is often really important, we find, for people when they pick JSON schema. I'm wondering, what was the sort of other things you consider? Was there any other sort of contenders when you're evaluating a potential solution?
I'm going to be honest, it has been like more than 5 years now, so I don't remember any specifics. I know we have used other kind of validation libraries, both in Python and JavaScript, but I don't think any of them were serious contenders against what we ended up using JSON schema for.
So, what did you find was the primary thing that when you were using JSON schema, you were just like, yeah, this is the right tool, this is the solution that we need?
I think the thing that really sold us for it was the amount of structure and the amount of kind of things we could do in code. Writing JSON by hand is easy enough, but being able to write code that would generate that JSON and let us reuse common definitions and stuff like that was really, really powerful. It kind of let us do exactly what we were picturing. We have a lot of kind of, not quite inheritance, but like shared base fields that we reuse across definitions. That in JavaScript, it's super easy to share those and reuse them. And yeah, again, that level of structure, we could build tooling both on the pre-processing side, but on the post-processing side to generate docs and generate error messages and stuff like that was really great.
Yeah, so being able to sort of reuse common parts, that's really interesting. I've seen some sort of solutions where they use templating to get around that, but it looks like I had a little look at some of the repositories that we talked about earlier before this call, and you're generating your schemas almost with a template, but with some added bits connected there. What would you say is the most interesting or surprising thing you found when sort of building that structure?
Interesting or surprising? I think we were sort of surprised with the level of specificity we could do. Again, these objects that we're validating are 3 to 5 layers deep and have sometimes hundreds of keys on them. So being able to run a root schema that does the whole tree was really cool, and ferrets out all the right errors, and that's great.
Oh, that's really useful. Thank you. So in terms of what you built originally and what you have today, what's kind of changed over that period? You're saying that's about 5 years ago. Obviously, that's a long time for a single sort of validation code base to exist in that sort of environment.
Yeah. So honestly, remarkably little has changed with the JSON schema side of it. That's sort of a testament to its longevity, that we could write it once, maintain it over the years, but not go through any significant changes. I think the biggest changes around that have been around other layers of validation, especially because we're also like linting actual JavaScript code. There's a lot of stuff that isn't covered in JSON schema, like, right, that lets us validate keys and not allowing extra keys and stuff. But there's a lot of other layers of kind of integration preparedness that we do now that aren't structural. They're more stylistic or things like that.
Okay. Excuse me. Obviously, being Zapier, you have a lot of integrations, and you're sending these schemas out to all of those developers that are building those integrations. How have you found JSON schema being received by those developers? Obviously, you had a sort of before and after, but also as your number of integrations grown, you also had I've seen people asking questions and querying about how it works within what you provide.
Yeah, it's been good. I think we abstract the use of JSON schema a little bit for our developers. So our CLI has a Zapier validate command, so that runs JSON schema under the hood, but then kind of just presents them with errors it finds. I think that has been a generally good experience, where one of the things we've really struggled with is writing kind of self-service error messages. So when something does violate the schema or is wrong, JSON schema has very specific errors, but not necessarily very approachable errors, especially if you don't know that it's JSON schema under the hood. So you're like, well, I have this app and it says that, my trigger doesn't comply with something, and like, it'll have an error message, but it's hard to sometimes bridge that gap. So we put a lot of energy into reprocessing JSON schema errors to be more specific. I think one of the big ones we ran into was violations of any of, or mostly any of schemas. It'll say, oh, this trigger is not one of basic hook operation or basic polling operation. And they're like, I don't know what either of those things are, because, we said, hey, trigger.operation has to be A or B, but it's hard for them to debug what they're missing. So we had a project to figure out which schema they're closest to, and then say, hey, this is what you missed on schema A, and hopefully that kind of gets them there. But it's been an interesting process. I think there's a lot of layers to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the sort of biggest challenges, I think, is people see a lot of errors and they don't know. They're like, well, I only want the errors that I need, right? And yeah, I was having a little look at that code base, and I noticed that, and I thought that was really interesting. So it's really good for you to bring that up, actually. Have you considered sort of rolling that out into its own sort of like tool and open source code for people to use?
We've talked about it a little bit. All the code I'm talking about today is open source, so definitely people can, within the license, pull it out and reuse it for their own stuff. I think it's not something we've tried to extract and package on its own, but it's certainly, if other people would find that useful, that's certainly on the cards.
Yeah, I know with most of the libraries, they have their own sort of output format. So obviously there's limited use within that. But with newer versions of JSON schema, there's a standardized output format that new implementations that are upgrading are using, and that can probably be used for the same sort of idea. So definitely that algorithm that you have, that you've spent a lot of time working on, as you say, you've invested a lot of effort into that. I think that's really interesting, and it's the code is really cleanly laid out and commented. So I'm hoping that someone can pick that up and run with it a bit.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be awesome. It's something we put a lot of energy into. One of our big goals is self-service, right? We don't want to be the kind of company where a developer is interested, but they have to email us for an API key or anything like that. You can get all the way from 0 to request to go public without ever waiting on us for anything. And that's it's hard. It's you have to make sure people can get unstuck when they hit weird errors. And energy goes into that.
Yeah. So obviously JSON schema has been really useful in terms of building integrations and enabling people to self-service, as you say, get past those problems and build integrations easier without taking up your time as well. How has JSON schema been used in other areas of the organization? Has your proof that JSON schema has value impacted other teams or other projects, and have you been sort of a catalyst in that?
Yeah, a little bit. We have our company, our engineering team has grown immeasurably in the last few years. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to try new things. Our team specifically has used JSON schema elsewhere in our backend. We use it in a couple areas to validate incoming request bodies, which is, Python and Django have other tools for that. But this let us, again, reuse some of these components. We can say, oh, we know what a trigger is supposed to look like, and we can validate that as it's coming in on a post body. We also, I believe, are using JSON schema for a project that I don't believe is released yet, but it'll be coming soon. And I think it makes heavy use of JSON. And so I think by extension, we do have a JSON schema for that to validate the structure.
I'll definitely keep an eye out for that then. So just sort of talking more broadly, with JSON schema being part of how you define a lot of your data models and structures as a single source of truth. You're using it for validation, but are you using it for sort of any other purposes, like generating code or generating forms or generating documentation? What sort of other use cases beyond validation are you finding and using?
Yeah, totally. So our big one is definitely documentation. We have our entire, I think it's 50 separate schemas that all kind of inherit and relate to each other, or what we use to validate the integrations themselves, but we can turn that entire thing and all of the properties. Each property has doc strings, everything into a big markdown document that we publish. So when there is a validation error locally for developer, there's a link they can click on that goes to like an actual documentation page for that property. And it's a whole, I got it open right now, and it's, I don't know, probably more than 5,000 lines. It's just, we generate a lot of stuff, and we have tooling around that. So that's definitely the biggest one. Trying to think, I know we use it for other things too. I guess one of the ones I've been working on and off. We have periodic kind of hackathons, and one of the ones I've been working on is improving our TypeScript definition files based on JSON schema. So there's a project that I've, again, tried off and on over the years to take our JSON schema and turn it into a TypeScript definition to kind of have the TypeScript version of what an app should look like. And I have gotten really close over the years, but some of the more complex function definitions have escaped me. And then again, that's not really a thing you can do in JSON schema anyway, to validate a JavaScript function definition. But it's definitely something we're looking into, because it would be nice. Again, it's all about this very self-serve developer experience. If we can get validation errors, right in front of them as they're developing, rather than waiting for them to run the validate command after they're done, or waiting for them to upload it and we come back and say there's an error. Being able to have that right in editor would be such a big boon to kind of developer speed and productivity.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of IDE tools generate, they use schemas for validation built in, which I know people like, particularly building config files, because it's all downloaded, which we talked about in another episode. But yeah, definitely providing in code tools to capture those potential errors before they even run the code as a sort of linting is I can see how that could be really valuable. That's really interesting.
It's great.
I know there are sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say because there are so many available properties, developers, will sit down with an NP trigger and say, okay, what can I add? What options do I have? And they have to go consult the documentation. With a great TypeScript definition, they could just say, okay, well, what are the properties available on this object? And it will just give it to them without having to go anywhere. It'll have documentation in line. It'll say what is or is not allowed. And it just solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because then you don't have to have a single JSON file that you're building some data in. You want it in your code. Object definition is useful. I know there are a few different projects which generate TypeScript types from JSON schema, but I don't know if they're different to what you're looking for. That's really interesting. Have you open sourced any of your sort of hackathon work on that?
I think so. I think it's just been in pull requests in our open source repo, so it's definitely out there. We didn't end up merging them, but I kind of left documentation for myself and the team to say, this is what we tried, this is what did and didn't work. And we can definitely, link those out. Anything we publish.
Yeah, that'll be useful. Thank you. So thinking more sort of broadly, does JSON Schema give you a certain confidence in terms of robustness in what you're building? Do you feel it enables you to move faster than you would have been able to otherwise with confidence?
I think so. I think it gives us a lot of confidence in the data we're receiving because it is unstructured, right? It can be any JSON object at all. And we need it to eventually conform to what we're storing in the database and using elsewhere in our code. Being able to know exactly the structure of it and what keys will and won't be there lets us write, say, less defensively, because we are still being defensive, but we can kind of write with more confidence that we know that, this thing will either be totally here or missing entirely, and write code that handles that accordingly.
Yeah, I can see how that's really, really useful. Just thinking on that a little bit more, is there any, did you consider using JSON LD for that sort of problem where you don't know the structure of the data and you could rearrange it at will?
No, I don't think I'm familiar with that project.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, it allows you to sort of augment JSON data to define specific data is located at that juncture. So you can say, oh, I want the person from that JSON, and it will get the person no matter where that is in the structure.
That's cool.
So it's interesting project, but not widely known.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to sort of touch on or bring up that you think will be useful?
I mean, I can talk about this forever, right? We have all of our, I think the biggest thing, and we were talking about this a little bit before the call, was our kind of use of inheritance, where we have all these shared structures that we can reuse across our schemas, and then we can declare dependencies between the schemas that allow us to build this very robust descriptive tree of what an integration should look like. So that's definitely something I would love to see kind of more first-party support for. Ours works for us, but I've run into this a couple other times. It's like, well, I have these 5 things that I want to show up in these 3 places. I can copy and paste them, but then you have to update them every time in each place. So stuff like that would definitely be cool.
Yeah, I mean, JSON Schema does have references, so you can definitely do schema reuse across different locations. But that is limited to schema objects. And you might have some more sort of elaborate things where you want to duplicate enum context or arrays and stuff like that. And yeah, there's no support for signaling inheritance or any sort of relational directional information. And it's something we know is something people want to do. And there is some work that has started, but it's a really challenging thing to do in a way that will be ubiquitous across multiple languages.
Sure.
And yeah, we're looking for someone to champion that work and drive it forward. There are sporadic bursts of energy spent on that, but yeah, that might change moving forward. As we may be getting more people on board full time with JSON Schema, so that's exciting on that front.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's one of the hardest parts of making cool productivity software, is that like suddenly your users want to do very cool things with it, even things you didn't consider before. Like, oh no, we don't support that yet, but that's something we could work on, and then you're sort of off to the races. Yeah,
I mean that's one of the reasons we spent such a long time developing the extension mechanism that we have in the newer versions of JSON Schema. In to give you an example, the form generation space. There are about 4 or 5 different well-used form generation tools that use JSON Schema as their base, and they each have a slightly different slant or slightly different levels of support, or don't support specific keywords. And being able to standardize that so people can use it server side or client side or anyhow they like, I think that'll be hugely valuable, but it's another area we'd like to work on.
Very cool.
Yeah, needs people to get involved, I guess.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much for making yourself available today, David. And that's been really I've been really intrigued to learn about this and to learn how you're using JSON Schema and Zapier, and I'm definitely going to dig into more on the repository that you have available with all the schemas. There was one more thing I wanted to touch on. Have you looked at you talked about the relational nature of your data that you're defining in JSON Schema. Have you looked at building a visual representation of that? Obviously, you have the markdown generated version of your schemas, but that doesn't visually show the relational nature.
No, it's not something we've super looked into. I think if we were going to do something like that, we'd probably do it more as a one-off. The overall structure doesn't change all that often, so I don't know. It's all that kind of balance between building a very cool tool that can do a process repeatedly versus like, oh, we only need this documentation kind of once and we can do a general structure and that'll be good. So if I had to guess right now, we'd probably just do that as a one-off. But I think it would be cool to build something that could generate that from the schema directly. Yeah, I don't know.
Great. Well, thank you so much for making time today to talk about JSON Schema in production at Zapier. And yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
That's been great. And I look forward to chatting again soon, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Sure will. Thank you.